A red Ferrari had just entered the abandoned repair shop on the outskirts of São Paulo when the engine made a strange noise and died. Carolina Monteiro, 36 years old, heiress to one of Brazil's largest dealership chains, stepped out of the car. Furious, looking around at this forgotten place that GPS had indicated as the nearest repair shop, there was no one there, just rusty tools, the smell of old oil, the silence of a business that had clearly closed long ago. Was about to call her driver when she felt something tugging at the hem of her designer red dress. It was a little girl, no more than 4 years old, with a face dirty with grease, hair tied in 2 crooked pigtails, and a white t-shirt full of stains. The child looked at her with enormous eyes and asked if the lady could give her father a job, because they were hungry and her father knew how to fix any car in the world. Even beautiful cars like that one. Carolina felt the ground disappear beneath her 500 reals heels. If you're ready for this story, type in the comments where you're watching this video from. Carolina Monteiro had been born with a silver spoon in her mouth, the only daughter of Roberto Monteiro, the man who had built the largest luxury vehicle dealership network in the state of São Paulo. Since childhood, she had learned that the world was divided into 2 categories: those who had power and those who served those who had it. Her father had raised her to belong to the first group, and she had absorbed this lesson with the dedication of an exemplary student. At 18, she was already working in the family business, learning every detail of the trade. At 25, she was commercial director. At 30, when her father suffered a stroke that left him partially incapacitated, she assumed the presidency of the group, with the naturalness of someone who always knew that place was rightfully hers. Under her leadership, Monteiro Vehicles had expanded from 12 to 28 dealerships, spread throughout the state and beginning to advance into Minas Gerais and Rio de Janeiro. She negotiated with international manufacturers as if they were old friends. She closed million-dollar contracts without blinking and had a reputation for being ruthless in business. The men in the sector feared and respected her in equal measure, which, for Carolina, was exactly as it should be. But what the financial reports and magazine covers didn't show was the emptiness she carried inside. At 36, Carolina lived alone in a 4,300 square foot penthouse in Jardim Europa with a view of Ibirapuera Park. She had a closet bigger than entire apartments, a handbag collection worth more than houses in upscale neighborhoods, no one in the world waiting for her at home at the end of the day. Her last relationship had ended 2 years ago when her boyfriend, a real estate businessman, had made it clear he expected her to reduce her working hours after marriage. Carolina had laughed in his face and asked for the restaurant check. Since then, she had dedicated herself exclusively to work, convincing herself that this was what made her happy. That Friday in September, she was returning from a meeting in Campinas when she decided to take a shortcut that her navigation app suggested. It was a mistake she normally would never make, taking unknown roads with a 2 million real Ferrari. But she was late for another meeting, and the main highway was congested. The car started making strange noises when she was already in the middle of an abandoned industrial area far from any dealership she knew. She tried to ignore it, accelerate, reach some civilized place, but the engine simply died, leaving her stopped in front of a repair shop that seemed to have been abandoned for years. And it was there, in that unlikely place, that a little girl dirty with grease would change her life forever. The repair shop had belonged to Rafael Santos's father and his father's father before that. 3 generations of mechanics who had built a solid reputation in the region, fixing trucks, buses, and passenger cars with the same dedication and competence. Rafael had grown up among engines and tools, learning the trade before he even learned to read properly. He had married at 23 to Mariana, his girlfriend since high school. She was a teacher at a municipal school, and together they had built a simple but happy life. When Isabella was born 4 years ago, Rafael thought his happiness was complete. He had a wife he loved, a healthy daughter, and a business that, although it didn't make him rich, guaranteed the family's livelihood with dignity. Then came the pandemic. The transportation companies, which were his main clients, closed or drastically reduced their fleets. Passenger cars stopped circulating. People stopped spending money on maintenance. Raphael saw his business drop 90% in a matter of weeks. He used all his savings to keep the shop open, to pay the 2 employees who depended on him, to keep the family from going without. But the savings ran out, the employees had to be let go, and when Raphael finally managed to reopen the shop after the worst of the crisis, he discovered that the world had changed. Large automotive maintenance chains had expanded, offering prices he couldn't compete with. Customers had found other mechanics or simply sold their vehicles. The shop that had supported his family for 3 generations was dying. The final blow came 8 months ago when Mariana was diagnosed with leukemia. The treatment was expensive, much more expensive than anything they could afford. Raphael sold everything he had, the house they had bought together, the car, the tools that weren't absolutely essential. He moved with his wife and daughter into the small apartment at the back of the shop. It's the same place where his grandfather had lived when he started the business decades ago. Mariana fought bravely for 6 months, but the disease was stronger. She died on a Tuesday morning with Raphael holding her hand and Isabella sleeping on the hospital sofa, too young to understand she would never see her mother again. Since then, Raphael existed in a limbo of survival. He couldn't work because he had no way to leave Isabella alone. He couldn't pay for daycare because he had no money. Couldn't get money because he couldn't work. It was a vicious circle that was slowly crushing him day after day. That Friday, he was sitting on the shop floor, looking at the last cans of beans left in the pantry, trying to calculate how many more days he could feed his daughter, when he heard the sound of a powerful engine dying outside. And when he went out to see what it was, he found his daughter talking to a woman in a red dress next to a Ferrari, worth more than everything he had ever owned in his entire life. Raphael ran toward his daughter, his heart racing with fear and shame. Fear that Isabella was bothering someone who might react badly. Shame that a stranger was seeing the misery they lived in his daughter's dirty clothes. The abandoned shop, all the evidence of his failure as a father and as a man. He picked Isabella up in his arms, apologizing to the woman in red, explaining that the girl didn't know what she was saying, that he was very sorry for the inconvenience. But the woman didn't seem irritated. She seemed something Raphael couldn't identify, something between shocked and fascinated, as if she were seeing something she had never seen before. Carolina looked at this man in his early 30s, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, an unshaven beard, and clothes that had clearly seen better days. She looked at the little girl in his arms, who now clung to her father's neck with the naturalness of someone who did this several times a day, and looked at the shop behind them, with its peeling walls and old equipment, but still a shop with tools and a hydraulic lift and everything else that would be needed to fix a car. She asked if he was a mechanic. Raphael replied that yes, or that he had been before everything fell apart. Carolina pointed to the Ferrari and said the car had died out of nowhere, that she didn't understand anything about mechanics, and asked if he could take a look. Raphael hesitated. It had been months since he worked on a car, and he had never worked on a Ferrari. Those machines were computers on wheels, full of electronics and systems he might not know. But something in that woman's eyes, an expectation he didn't want to disappoint, made him agree. Besides, he needed to prove to himself that he was still capable, that years of experience hadn't evaporated, along with everything else he had lost. He sat Isabella down on a safe stool in the corner of the shop, near the door where he could see her at all times. The girl was used to this routine, these moments of waiting while her father worked. She picked up some nuts and bolts she found on the floor and began to play, building imaginary towers with the serious concentration of small children. Raphael opened the Ferrari's hood and for a moment stood still, just looking. The engine was a work of art, each component positioned with millimetric precision, each part shining under the weak light that entered through the shop's dirty windows. It was different from the engines he was used to, more complex, more intimidating, but it was also at its core just an engine. And engines? Raphael understood. Carolina watched in silence, leaning against a wall she hoped was clean, arms crossed over her chest. She didn't understand anything he was doing, but she was impressed by the concentration on his face, the way his hands moved with precision among the components, the naturalness with which he manipulated that complex machine. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he worked, a silent dance between man and machine. After 20 minutes, Raphael closed the hood and said he had found the problem. It was an electrical connection that had come loose, probably due to excessive vibration on some irregular road. He could fix it in a few minutes if she wanted to wait. His tone was professional, almost indifferent, but Carolina noticed the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. He had solved the problem. He still knew how to do his job. Carolina nodded without saying anything. She stood there watching that man work while the little girl played with some nuts and bolts on the floor, as if they were the most precious toys in the world. And for the first time in a long time, Carolina felt something she couldn't name, a connection with something real, something human, something that her million-dollar contracts and board meetings had never managed to give her. When Raphael finished, the Ferrari started on the first try, purring as if nothing had happened. Carolina asked how much she owed. Raphael said she didn't need to pay anything, that it had been a simple repair, but Carolina insisted. And when he finally said a ridiculously low amount, she pulled a 500 reals bill from her purse and placed it in his hand before he could protest. Then she did something that surprised them both. She asked if she could come back the next day because she had other cars that needed maintenance. Was tired of dealerships that charged fortunes for simple services. Raphael didn't know what to say. Did this story move you? Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Ready? Let's continue. He just nodded, still holding the 500 reals bill as if it were an object from another planet. Carolina got into the Ferrari, started the engine, and left. But during the entire drive back to São Paulo, she couldn't stop thinking about that shop, that man. That little girl in a dirty t-shirt who had asked if she could give her father a job. Carolina returned the next day, as she had promised, but didn't bring another car to fix. She brought grocery bags, new clothes for Isabella, and a business proposal that left Raphael speechless. She explained that she had spent the night researching, thinking, calculating. Montero Vehicles had its own fleet of more than 50 vehicles, demonstration cars, executive vehicles, transport trucks. All this maintenance was outsourced to shops that charged absurd prices and frequently did questionable quality work. Carolina was proposing that Raphael take over all this maintenance with a fixed monthly contract that guaranteed a stable salary. But it wasn't just that. She was also proposing to renovate the shop, modernize the equipment, transform that abandoned place into a center of excellence in automotive maintenance. It would be an investment by Montero Vehicles, and Raphael would be the manager. With profit sharing and freedom to hire his own team, Raphael listened to everything in silence, trying to process what was happening. This didn't make sense. People like Carolina Montero didn't appear out of nowhere and offer opportunities like this to bankrupt mechanics. There was something wrong, some trap he wasn't seeing. He asked why she was doing this. Carolina thought for a moment before answering. She said she didn't know exactly. She said she had seen something in the way he worked, dedication and care that she rarely saw on much better paid professionals. She said his daughter had asked if she could give her father a job, and that question had been echoing in her head all night. But the truth, she admitted, was more complicated than that. The truth was that she was 36 years old and had a life that, seen from the outside, seemed perfect, but inside was empty. She had power, money, success, and no real connection to anything or anyone. And when she saw Raphael working on that Ferrari with his daughter playing beside him, she felt an envy she had never felt before. Envy of someone who, even having lost almost everything, still had something worth fighting for. She wasn't doing charity, she clarified. She was making an investment. An investment in a competent professional, yes, but also an investment in herself. She wanted to be part of something real, something that wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Raphael looked at Isabella, who was trying on one of the new dresses Carolina had brought. Spinning in front of an imaginary mirror, with the joy of a child who doesn't know she should be sad, he thought of Mariana, what she would say if she could see this scene. And he knew with a certainty he hadn't felt in a long time that he needed to accept the following months. Brought a transformation no one could have predicted. The shop was renovated from floor to ceiling with new equipment, new paint, a small recreation space for Isabella with toys, books, and a television. Raphael hired 2 mechanics who had worked with his father and were equally unemployed. and together they began to service not only the Montero's vehicles fleet, but also private customers who heard about the quality service. Carolina appeared regularly, sometimes with cars for maintenance, sometimes just to check how things were going. At first, her visits were strictly professional meetings about numbers and contracts and expansion plans, but gradually they became more personal. She stayed longer, talked to Raphael about things that had nothing to do with business, played with Isabella as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Isabella became attached to Carolina with an intensity that surprised everyone, especially Carolina herself. The little girl followed her everywhere when she visited the shop, showed her drawings, told stories about the school she now attended thanks to her father's new salary. And Carolina, who had never had patience for children, discovered that with Isabella it was different. With Isabella, she wanted to have patience, wanted to hear every story, see every drawing, be present in every small moment. Raphael observed this closeness with a mixture of gratitude and caution. He didn't want Isabella to become attached to someone who might disappear from their lives at any moment. And he didn't want to become attached either, because he knew people like Carolina didn't stay in places like that, with people like him. But Carolina was changing in ways she didn't fully understand herself. She began to delegate more at work, to trust her team to solve problems she used to insist on solving personally. She began to leave the office at reasonable hours, to have free weekends, to rediscover that there was a life beyond spreadsheets and contracts. She also began to question things she previously accepted without thinking. The way she treated her employees, it's distant and impersonal. The way she conducted business always focused on maximum profit without considering the people behind the numbers. The way she lived alone in a huge penthouse, surrounded by expensive things that meant nothing. One night, after a particularly long visit to the shop, Carolina was driving back to São Paulo when she realized she didn't want to go home. Her penthouse in Jardins was beautiful and empty, and she was tired of emptiness. She turned around and went back to the shop, where Raphael was still working on a car, while Isabella slept on the office sofa. She entered without knocking, found Raphael lying under a car with only his legs showing, and stood there, not knowing what to say. When he came out from under the car and saw her, covered in grease on his hands and with a tired expression, he didn't ask what she was doing there. Just smiled and asked if she wanted coffee. They talked until dawn. Sitting on the shop floor, drinking bad coffee from an old coffee maker, Raphael told her about Mariana, about the illness, about the months of desperation. Carolina told him about her gilded and lonely childhood, about her distant father who only knew how to show love through money, about all the relationships she had sabotaged because she didn't know how to be vulnerable. When the sun began to rise, they were still talking. And at some point during that night, something had changed between them. Something neither was ready to name, but both felt with frightening clarity. The first kiss happened 3 months later, on a Christmas Eve neither would ever forget. Carolina had decided to spend the holiday at the shop, claiming she had no plans, and it would be nice to have company. Raphael had prepared a simple dinner: roasted chicken with rice and farofa, the recipes Mariana used to make and that he had learned to replicate to give Isabella a taste of normalcy. Isabella was radiant, running from one side to the other in a green Christmas dress Carolina had bought her, talking about Santa Claus and the presents she hoped to receive. She had made drawings for both of them, one for Daddy and one for Aunt Carol, as she had started calling Carolina in recent weeks. After dinner, while Isabella slept on the sofa, hugging a new doll, Raphael and Carolina stood on the improvised porch overlooking the shop's parking lot. It wasn't the most romantic setting in the world, but there were stars in the sky, and the air was fresh, and they were together, and that was enough. Raphael said he didn't know how to thank her for everything she had done. Carolina said she didn't want thanks. She said he had given her much more than she had given him. He had shown her there were other ways to live, other priorities besides work and money. He and Isabella had become the family she never knew she needed. That's when he kissed her. Or maybe she kissed him first. Neither remembered exactly afterward. What they remembered was the feeling of finally being in the right place, with the right person, at the right time. The following months brought even bigger changes. Carolina reduced her participation in the family business, hiring a professional CEO for day-to-day operations and maintaining only an advisory role. She bought a house on the outskirts of Snow Hollow, close enough to the shop for Raphael to get to work easily, but far enough from the city for Isabella to have space to run and play. They moved in together 6 months after the first kiss in an informal ceremony that basically consisted of carrying boxes from one place to another, while Isabella supervised and gave orders. The girl adapted to the new life with the flexibility of children, accepting Carolina not as a substitute for the mother she barely remembered, but as a new piece in her family, different but equally important. The wedding happened a year later. In a small ceremony held in the garden of the new house, Isabella was the flower girl, throwing flower petals with more enthusiasm than precision, and the guests were just the shop employees, some Montero Vehicles executives who had become true friends, and Carolina's father, who had recovered enough from the stroke to attend and who cried, seeing his daughter finally happy. Today, 3 years after that afternoon when a red Ferrari broke down in front of an abandoned shop, the lives of all three are unrecognizable. The shop became a network of 5 units spread throughout Greater Snow Hollow, all managed by Raphael with the same care and dedication he learned from his father and grandfather. Carolina divides her time between the family company's board and social projects she created to help mechanics and small business owners in vulnerable situations. Isabella is now 7.5 years old, and when people ask about her family, she explains with the naturalness of someone who never knew another reality. She says she has a daddy who fixes cars and a mommy Carol who fixes companies, and that sometimes they fix things together, especially when mommy's car makes strange noises on the way to school. She no longer remembers that afternoon when she asked a stranger if she could give her father a job. But Raphael and Carolina remember. They remember every detail of that unlikely moment that changed their lives forever. Sometimes, on summer nights, when Isabella is already asleep and the house is silent, they sit on the porch and look at the stars. And Raphael tells the same story he tells every time, about a princess in a red dress who appeared in a broken carriage and was saved by a mechanic and his brave daughter. Carolina always laughs and says it was the other way around, that she was the one who was saved, that she was lost in a life that meant nothing, and that a little girl in a dirty t-shirt showed her the way back to what really mattered. And maybe they're both right. Maybe saving yourself is just that finding someone who's equally lost and deciding to get lost together until they find a new path. A path that neither could have found alone, no matter how hard they tried. The red Ferrari still exists. It's stored in their garage, covered by a protective tarp, a symbol of the day it all began. Carolina doesn't drive it often anymore. She prefers the practical SUV that fits the whole family in travel bags. But sometimes, on special Sundays, she takes the Ferrari out for a short drive, just to hear the engine roar, and remember that afternoon when fate decided to break down in front of the right shop. Because sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in problems. Sometimes a broken car is actually a door opening. And sometimes a simple question from a hungry child can be the beginning of a love story no one expected. Can you give my father a job? We're hungry. 7 words. 7 words that changed 3 lives forever. If this story made you believe that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive, disguised as problems, and that love can be born in the most unlikely places, leave a sign of your presence here, a heart, a simple gesture to tell me these words found their way to you. Because every story deserves to be heard, and every heart deserves to find its way back home.